The year was 1305, and the streets of London buzzed with everyday life. Merchants shouted, selling freshly baked bread and rich ale. Horses trotting steadily, their hooves rhythmically tapping against worn cobblestones. Children darted between stalls, laughing as the sunlight gently warmed the bustling city. But beneath the ordinary hum of daily life lingered something darker, something that tingled with a strange, unsettling anticipation. That August morning was different. Today wasn't about routine or commerce. It was about spectacle. Whispers had rippled through every alleyway and tavern in the city. William Wallace, the fierce Scottish rebel who had haunted King Edward's dreams and fueled the imaginations of ordinary people, was finally captured. And today was the day of his execution. London on this particular morning was not just a city. It was a stage, set deliberately to display the power of the English crown. The king himself, Edward I, known by many as Longshanks, understood the power of fear. He didn't just want Wallace dead. He needed Wallace humiliated, stripped not only of life, but of dignity, of legacy, and of hope. The execution wasn't simply a punishment, it was a deliberate act of psychological warfare, a performance intended to echo through generations. Now in popular culture, we've come to picture Wallace's final moments with a certain romantic bravery. A proud hero swiftly executed, a martyr dying nobly. Yet the truth, often lost beneath the polished veneer of legend, was far more horrifying, more calculated, and infinitely more brutal. Longshanks had chosen the cruelest punishment medieval justice had to offer: hanging, drawing, and quartering, a spectacle reserved only for the worst traitors. This wasn't about justice. It was about annihilation, a total destruction meant to break the spirit of a nation. To fully understand the terrifying reality Wallace faced, we must first go back and understand the world that produced such a moment. Medieval Scotland at the close of the 13th century was a land in turmoil. Loyalty was fragile, shifting according to the tides of survival rather than patriotism. It was a fractured world where the notion of Scottish unity was more dream than reality. Edward I viewed Scotland as just another rebellious territory to be subdued, like Wales before it. To him, the northern kingdom was simply another prize, a symbol of his power to be brought firmly under English rule. But William Wallace wasn't born into power, nor did he seek it for himself. Instead, he rose from relative obscurity as a small landowner whose life had been marked by personal tragedy and loss. It was these experiences, his family shattered, his land desecrated by foreign invaders, that ignited within him an unstoppable rage, a passionate desire to see Scotland free. In 1297, Wallace's rage crystallized into a moment of legendary victory at Stirling Bridge. There he led a ragtag army of Scots against England's mighty cavalry and miraculously won. It was a victory that shocked the English and emboldened the Scots. Wallace didn't just defeat an army, he shattered a myth that English dominance was inevitable, that resistance was futile. But Edward Longshanks, a king hardened by years of rebellion, would never accept such defiance. His reputation was forged in iron and blood, from crushing uprisings in Wales to expelling entire communities from England. To Edward, Wallace wasn't merely an enemy soldier. He was an existential threat. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge couldn't just be erased. It needed to be turned into a stark warning. By 1305, Scotland's resistance had crumbled under relentless pressure from English armies and political betrayal from its own nobility. Most Scottish leaders, tired of war and fearing total annihilation, bowed before Edward's might, submitting their swords and bending their knees. Yet Wallace continued to fight, stubbornly, defiantly, becoming an uncomfortable reminder of resistance, an embarrassment to those who had chosen survival over principle. Thus began the relentless hunt for William Wallace. English officials placed a substantial bounty on his head, turning ally against ally, neighbor against neighbor. The net tightened slowly, steadily, as whispers and rumors surrounded Wallace wherever he went. Betrayal was inevitable, and eventually it came from within Scotland itself. In August 1305, near Glasgow, Wallace was betrayed and captured, reportedly by a knight named Sir John Menteith, a man who had once stood beside him. History remains murky about the details, but the outcome was tragically clear. Wallace, the living symbol of Scotland's defiance, was now firmly in English hands. The journey to London was itself a cruel, extended punishment. Bound and paraded through towns and villages, Wallace was displayed to cheering crowds as a captured trophy. It was psychological torture, a calculated humiliation designed to erode whatever remained of his spirit. By the time Wallace reached London weeks later, he had already endured unimaginable degradation. But this was only the prelude. On August 23, 1305, a mockery of a trial began in Westminster Hall. Charges of treason, murder, and sacrilege were read out, not in English or Scots Gaelic, but Latin, a language likely unfamiliar to Wallace. When allowed to speak, Wallace declared defiantly, clearly, and unapologetically that he could not betray a king he had never served. This act of brave defiance sealed his fate. Though the outcome had never truly been in doubt, the judges loyal to Edward pronounced Wallace guilty. The sentence, delivered with grim ceremonial precision, was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Each act of violence in the execution held symbolic meaning. His hanging represented his shame, his drawing symbolized public humiliation, his disembowelment the destruction of his humanity, and the quartering, his complete obliteration from history. As the sun rose high over London, crowds from across England had gathered, eager to witness the spectacle. The atmosphere was disturbingly festive, almost celebratory. People bought pies and ale, claiming the best views for what promised to be a gruesome event. At the Tower of London, Wallace was stripped, bound, and tied to a wooden hurdle, a cruelly designed device meant to drag him through the city's busiest streets. As horses pulled him along, his skin tore against rough stone, blood marking every inch of his final path. Yet through all of this, William Wallace remained silent, his gaze fixed defiantly forward, a silent declaration that, despite their best efforts, the English had not yet won. The spectacle had only begun. Little did the crowds know, the worst was yet to come. As Wallace's battered body was dragged through London, the city seemed to pulse with a disturbing energy. Crowds cheered, jeered, and shouted insults, their voices merging into a chaotic chorus of hatred and curiosity. This wasn't justice, it was entertainment, and William Wallace, once Scotland's fierce hero, was now their spectacle. Yet beneath their laughter and taunts lurked an uncomfortable truth. Many in that crowd had once feared Wallace, admired him even. Now they were safe, reassured by the spectacle of his suffering. He had been reduced to an object, stripped of humanity and pride, paraded through the streets as a grotesque trophy. But even through the fog of humiliation and agony, something inside Wallace remained unbroken. His dignity, a stubborn ember that refused to be extinguished. Smithfield awaited him, the infamous execution ground known for ending countless lives in agonizing public displays. As the procession reached the scaffold, the festive atmosphere intensified. Vendors sold ale and pastries to spectators who eagerly jostled for the best view. It was almost surreal, a bizarre carnival built around cruelty. Wallace was lifted onto the scaffold, where an executioner awaited him, grim-faced and efficient. He'd performed dozens of such executions before. His hands moved with practiced ease, yet this execution was different. Wallace wasn't just another criminal. He was a symbol. The English crown intended to extinguish not just his life, but the very idea he represented: Scottish freedom. First, Wallace was hanged, but not the swift execution reserved for common criminals. Instead, the rope was carefully positioned to slowly choke him, ensuring his agony stretched out before the eager audience. Wallace twisted and struggled instinctively, his face darkening as he gasped desperately for air. The crowd roared louder, urging on the executioner, savoring every painful second. At the precise moment before unconsciousness granted him mercy, Wallace was cut down. His body crumpled to the wooden platform, chest heaving, heart pounding. He barely had time to recover his breath before the next phase began, the horrific spectacle of drawing. The executioner approached him with a sharp blade, sunlight gleaming cruelly along its edge. The crowd fell silent, eager eyes wide with anticipation. Slowly, methodically, the executioner began his grim task, slicing open Wallace's abdomen. Wallace's screams echoed through the streets, a raw, primal sound that haunted even the most hardened spectator. But the executioner's skill lay not in speed, but in prolonging Wallace's torment. Each organ was carefully removed one by one, then held high for the crowd to witness before being thrown into a roaring fire. The flames hissed and crackled as Wallace's humanity burned away. Symbolically, this wasn't just torture. It was meant to demonstrate that even the mightiest hero could be systematically broken down into nothing. Yet, astonishingly, through the unimaginable pain, Wallace never pleaded, never begged for mercy. His refusal to break became as powerful a message as the execution itself. The very thing Edward had feared most, that Wallace might inspire even in death, was quietly unfolding. In medieval belief, the bowels represented human compassion and courage. By destroying them publicly, the executioner was attempting to erase Wallace's very essence, to reduce him to something less than human. Yet the act itself paradoxically elevated him, turning his suffering into a profound symbol of defiance. Throughout this nightmare, Wallace remained agonizingly conscious. Historical accounts describe his eyes wide and alert, staring upward or beyond the crowd, fixed on something no one else could see. Some witnesses claimed he whispered prayers or words of defiance, though no definitive record survives of his exact words. But at that moment, Wallace's voice was unnecessary. His endurance itself spoke volumes. When the executioner had finally removed the last of Wallace's organs, an eerie quiet settled over Smithfield. Wallace still breathed, weakly but stubbornly, his life lingering despite every effort to destroy it. Finally, the executioner raised his heavy axe, preparing to deliver the merciful final blow. With a swift, clean stroke, Wallace's head was severed, releasing him at last from suffering. The sudden silence was profound, a stark contrast to the chaos moments before. But the humiliation didn't end with his death. Wallace's severed head, still dripping with blood, was held aloft, displayed triumphantly to the cheering crowd. It would later be dipped in tar and impaled on London Bridge, left there for all who passed to see. His body, now headless, was methodically cut into 4 quarters, each piece serving a gruesome political purpose. Each limb would be sent to a different Scottish city, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, as stark warnings to anyone contemplating rebellion. As the crowd dispersed, many believed Edward's objective had been achieved, a message sent, a rebel crushed, a people subdued. Wallace's body parts scattered across Scotland were meant as symbols of English dominance. Yet beneath that apparent triumph simmered an unintended consequence, something Edward had never anticipated. Wallace's very destruction had inadvertently transformed him from rebel to martyr. Word spread swiftly through England and Scotland about the harrowing details of Wallace's final hours. People whispered of his bravery, his refusal to break, the unimaginable cruelty of his execution. Far from extinguishing resistance, the spectacle had ignited something far more powerful: outrage and defiance. In the taverns of Edinburgh, Stirling, and Glasgow, ordinary Scots raised secret toasts to Wallace's memory. Stories of his courage became whispered legends told by firelight, passed from village to village. Wallace had been intended as a warning, yet instead became a rallying cry, a symbol that the fight for freedom was not yet over. Edward Longshanks had sought to erase Wallace from history, But through his very brutality he ensured the opposite, that Wallace would never be forgotten. In the months following Wallace's brutal execution, England seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how Scotland would respond. King Edward had intended Wallace's horrific end to terrify the Scots into submission, to extinguish forever any embers of rebellion. But brutality, especially when excessive, can often produce unexpected results. Throughout Scotland, Wallace's death stirred something deep within the soul of the people. Stories of his courage, endurance, and refusal to surrender spread quietly, secretly whispered in cottages and castles alike. Instead of breaking the Scottish spirit, Wallace's death had galvanized it, becoming a powerful symbol of resistance against oppression. Yet outwardly Scotland appeared subdued. Many nobles had openly sworn allegiance to Edward, fearful of their own survival. On the surface, it seemed Edward had won, his dominance secure, his rule unquestioned. But beneath this apparent calm, hidden currents of resistance flowed strong, invisible but potent. In taverns across Edinburgh and Aberdeen, Wallace's sacrifice was toasted quietly among friends, their voices hushed in respect and defiance. They recounted his bravery at Stirling Bridge, remembered how he had risen from humble origins to challenge a king, and how even in death he had refused to be broken. Slowly but surely, Wallace became more than a man. He evolved into a powerful idea, a living embodiment of Scottish freedom. The English had failed to understand something fundamental about human nature. People are seldom inspired by victories alone. More often it is suffering, sacrifice, and loss that ignite the deepest forms of resistance. Wallace's execution had been intended to end Scottish rebellion, yet paradoxically, it became the catalyst for renewed determination. Among those moved deeply by Wallace's fate was Robert the Bruce, a Scottish noble whose own relationship with the English crown was complicated and fraught. Bruce, ambitious and pragmatic, had been cautious in openly supporting Wallace. Yet now, the memory of Wallace's bravery haunted him, constantly reminding him of the price of freedom and the cost of compromise. Legend has it that Bruce was deeply shaken upon learning the gruesome details of Wallace's execution. The horror of what Edward had done lingered in his thoughts, reshaping his vision of what was truly at stake. Wallace's brutal end stripped away any illusions Bruce might have had about English mercy or honor. He realized clearly and painfully that submission was not peace, it was merely delayed destruction. Thus, Wallace's death began quietly reshaping Scotland's destiny, influencing the hearts and minds of people who had once been willing to accept English rule out of fear or practicality. Wallace had shown them something vital. Defiance, even when it ended tragically, was a powerful act, an act capable of inspiring generations. Meanwhile, the physical remains of Wallace, scattered strategically across Scotland, had become silent, gruesome reminders of Edward's ruthlessness. Intended to frighten and subdue, these remains instead became potent symbols. Each severed limb was quietly mourned by the people who saw them. They became sacred relics, objects of reverence rather than fear. The display of Wallace's mutilated body parts, intended as humiliation, turned instead into memorials that quietly strengthened Scottish resolve. But Edward I, sitting confidently in London, remained oblivious to these subtle shifts in sentiment. He continued believing that fear alone was enough to secure control, certain that brutality had bought his peace. He had misread the situation badly. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered, and the fire Wallace had ignited smoldered fiercely, just waiting for the right spark. That spark would come sooner than Edward imagined. Robert the Bruce, inspired by Wallace's courage, soon found himself compelled by circumstances and personal conscience to reclaim Scotland's fight for independence. Wallace's memory pushed him toward a fateful decision. He would rise openly against Edward, determined not to let Wallace's death be in vain. Bruce's journey toward rebellion was marked by hesitation and doubt, but Wallace's legacy continually pushed him forward, guiding him through moments of despair. Historical accounts describe Bruce retreating to isolated places, haunted by internal struggle, wrestling with fear and uncertainty. Yet each time he wavered, the image of Wallace's unwavering courage returned, urging him onward. Ultimately, Robert the Bruce would become what Wallace could not, the unifying figure who rallied Scotland behind a common cause. Wallace had ignited the fire. Bruce would fan the flames into a blaze powerful enough to challenge English rule. Wallace's gruesome execution had not destroyed resistance. Instead, it had ensured its survival, hidden but alive, waiting patiently for another to pick up the sword and continue the fight. In death, Wallace had become immortal. The horror inflicted upon him had transformed into inspiration, transcending time, class, and regional divisions. He was no longer simply a man, but had become Scotland itself, the embodiment of its suffering, resilience, and hope. Yet even as Scotland slowly found its renewed purpose, Edward's grip tightened, desperate to maintain control. Spies roamed villages, informants whispered in shadows, and every sign of defiance was swiftly crushed. But despite the risks, the whispers grew louder. Rebellion began quietly spreading, invisible to the English but tangible to every Scot. Wallace's martyrdom resonated deeply because it revealed a truth that even Edward's brutality couldn't erase: the power of hope. Even after witnessing the worst possible punishment, people still chose resistance. Wallace had shown Scotland that true defeat only occurred when hope died, and hope, stubborn and resilient, refused to fade. Across Scotland, Wallace's spirit quietly forged a new kind of resistance, one stronger because it wasn't driven by fear but by courage and determination. Farmers, craftsmen, and nobles alike began asking themselves, if Wallace had faced such horror without breaking, could they not find within themselves the strength to stand? Slowly, quietly, Wallace's execution had transformed from tragedy into triumph. Not a military victory, but a profound moral victory that laid the foundation for Scotland's future. As whispers of rebellion began rising into louder calls, it was clear that William Wallace's story wasn't over. It had simply entered a new, powerful chapter. As the embers of Wallace's sacrifice glowed quietly in Scotland's heart, Edward I remained certain of his victory. Yet history often has a sense of poetic justice, turning acts of cruelty into symbols of defiance. Edward's brutal attempt to crush rebellion had instead provided Scotland with an enduring inspiration, a symbol more powerful than any army. William Wallace's horrific end didn't silence the Scots. It strengthened their resolve. Within a few years, the whispered stories became open acts of defiance, challenging English power once again. Robert the Bruce, who had long wrestled with loyalty and ambition, finally stepped forward decisively, assuming the mantle that Wallace had carried with such fierce dignity. At Bannockburn in 1314, Bruce would lead Scotland to a victory so decisive that it would echo through history as the ultimate vindication of Wallace's sacrifice. The connection between Wallace's brutal execution and Bannockburn's triumph wasn't lost on the Scots. Soldiers at Bannockburn charged into battle carrying memories of Wallace's courage deep in their hearts. His name, whispered among troops on the eve of battle, became a call to bravery. Wallace, though dead, was very much alive, his spirit marching alongside them, his defiance carried in every sword thrust, every battle cry. When Bruce finally secured Scotland's independence, it wasn't just a military victory, it was the moral culmination of Wallace's fight. Wallace had dared Scotland to dream. Bruce made the dream reality. But Wallace's legacy transcended military victories. His story became ingrained in Scotland's soul, shaping its very identity. In the decades and centuries that followed, Wallace became more than a historical figure. He was elevated to a mythical hero. Songs and ballads spread across the Scottish Highlands and Lowlands, recounting his life, his bravery, and the unimaginable price he'd paid. Each generation that followed heard these stories, passing them down like sacred treasures, ensuring Wallace's sacrifice was never forgotten. Yet his legend was more than just romantic idealism. Wallace's execution profoundly impacted the concept of justice and human rights across Europe. Over time, historians, legal scholars, and philosophers looked back on his brutal death, reflecting on how easily humanity slips into cruelty when unchecked by conscience. The excesses of Edward's punishment drew critical attention, laying early foundations for concepts of human dignity, even in warfare and punishment. By publicly destroying Wallace in such an exaggerated way, Edward had unintentionally sparked a moral backlash. Over the centuries, Wallace's execution was cited in arguments against torture, cruel punishment, and state-sponsored violence. What was intended to erase Wallace from history instead made him an enduring lesson in compassion, dignity, and humanity's constant struggle against cruelty. Culturally, Wallace's story evolved from historical fact into artistic inspiration. Poems, paintings, novels, and eventually films recounted his life and death. Each retelling, from medieval ballads to Hollywood movies, carried Wallace's spirit forward. The brutality of his execution paradoxically only intensified public fascination, continually renewing his relevance and impact. Yet beyond artistic portrayals and symbolic meanings, Wallace's most significant legacy remains deeply personal. To this day, Scots find inspiration in his story, drawing strength from his unyielding resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. The pain he endured became a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, a testament to how courage can endure even in the darkest moments. Modern historians acknowledge that Wallace was not perfect. He was a product of his time, shaped by brutality and violence. Yet even acknowledging those imperfections only makes his legacy richer, more human. Wallace wasn't just a hero or a martyr. He was a complex man who rose above tragedy and horror to become a symbol of hope. Ultimately, Wallace's brutal death served as a powerful, lasting lesson. Oppression never fully achieves its goal. It may silence voices temporarily, it may instill fear, but it inevitably plants seeds of defiance. Wallace's execution was intended to break Scotland, yet it united it instead. His suffering revealed a deeper truth, that some principles are worth any cost, even life itself. Today, Wallace's memory still resonates powerfully. Visitors stand in silence at monuments dedicated to him across Scotland. Tourists walk the battlefield of Stirling Bridge, imagining the chaos and courage of that distant day. And at the Tower of London, tourists quietly remember that this place, now peaceful, was once the setting of unimaginable cruelty. The lessons of Wallace's life and death remain profoundly relevant today. In a world still grappling with oppression and human rights abuses, his story is a reminder that freedom, dignity, and courage always matter, and are always worth defending even at great personal cost. The medieval streets of London have long been paved over, the blood washed away centuries ago. Yet if you stand quietly enough, listening closely, you might still hear echoes of Wallace's courage carried gently on the wind. His legacy, stubborn and defiant, reminds us that even the darkest acts of cruelty cannot extinguish hope. Edward's punishment failed because he misunderstood the human heart. He saw only flesh and blood, not spirit and soul. Wallace endured unimaginable suffering, yet his defiance remained untouched. That defiance became a spark that ignited Scotland's freedom, transformed history, and continues to inspire even now. William Wallace's journey wasn't merely one of suffering and death. It was a journey into the very core of human resilience. His life asked a profound question. What does it mean to be truly free? His death provided an unforgettable answer. Freedom lies not in submission, but in dignity, defiance, and the unwavering courage to stand for something greater than oneself. Today, as we remember William Wallace, we're not just recalling history, we're reflecting on the enduring power of hope, dignity, and the human spirit. Wallace's execution, intended as annihilation, instead became his ultimate triumph. His voice, once silenced, now echoes louder than ever. Perhaps Wallace's story challenges each of us to consider what we stand for, what we believe in, and what price we would pay for our own freedom. And perhaps in that quiet reflection we find the true legacy of William Wallace, a reminder that hope, courage, and dignity are worth fighting for, living for, and yes, even dying for. William Wallace died a martyr but lived forever as a legend, and in that legend Scotland and the world found a truth powerful enough to endure eternity.